If you've been following my easy gaming history videos, you know that I've been covering the history of video games in a very chronological order. Now, I've decided to change up the format of these videos a little bit because while I want to be able to give a general overview of gaming history, I also want to go in depth on a lot of the topics that I've been covering. So rather than creating a bunch of shorter videos that lack the depth I was hoping to cover, I'm going to make some longer form videos on general gaming history and then go back and make specialized videos on the subjects that I find more interesting or that are the most requested by you. I feel a little bad because some of the information in the first couple of videos is going to get repeated in these new and improved ones, but I've never made a video series before and nobody's perfect. With that, today I'm going to go over a complete history of home consoles. Since there are 9 generations of gaming consoles, there actually are quite a bit of them to cover, so I won't go too in depth on each of them. I'm just going to give you a general release year, as well as some general specifications that each system had. I also want to specify that I will be covering handheld gaming consoles in a different video, so they will not be featured in this one, and make sure you keep an eye out for that future video. Now, the way console generations are divided is the actual technological capabilities of the consoles themselves. That basically just means that a lot of consoles that, for example, came out in Gen 2 might have still been coming out as Gen 2 consoles when Gen 3 was beginning. Starting back in the first generation, we have the Magnavox Odyssey, Atari Pong, and the Coleco's Telestar series. I already covered the 1972 Odyssey in a previous video, but to those who don't feel like going back, the Odyssey was the first home game console. It featured static pling overlays, 2 controllers, and was powered by 6C batteries. Yep, not only did it have basically no graphics besides 3 dots and a line, but the damn thing couldn't even plug into the wall. Following the Odyssey, Atari released a home version of the Pong arcade game. The development of the first Atari Pong home console is actually pretty interesting. In 1974, Atari engineer Harold Lee proposed a home version of Pong that would connect to a television. Home Pong. Very creative, I know. What was cool about Home Pong was that Lee and Pong's programmer Alan Alcorn created a single large-scale integration chip that would house the game inside the console. Remarkably, this chip was actually the highest performing chip to ever be in a consumer product back in 1974. Sears Telegames, now if there are kids watching, Sears was just the big department store of the time, ordered approximately 150,000 home Pong units, and it was completely sold out by the 1975 Christmas season. In 1976, Atari released Pong home consoles under their own name and followed up the original home Pong with a whole bunch of variations. There was Pong Doubles, there was Super Pong, there was Super Pong 10, there was Super Pong Pro Am 10, Ultra Pong Doubles, enough Pong for everyone, supposedly. The only console Atari ended up releasing that featured a game other than Pong was the 1977 dedicated console called Video Pinball. This featured 4 pinball variations, a basketball game, and 2 versions of Atari's Breakout. Now, in 1975, Magnavox began their production of the Odyssey series to follow up the first console. The Odyssey 100 was able to eliminate a large amount of the overlays that were required by the original console, as well as added elements such as sound and scoring to the machine. This was followed by the Odyssey 200 and 1976's Odyssey 300, which were basically the same machine. The Odyssey 400 added on-screen scoring to the system. This was followed by the Odyssey 500, which featured on-screen color. In 1977, they skipped a bunch of numbers and released Odyssey 2000, 3000, and 4000, which were, again, just kind of the same machine with minor cosmetic differences. The Coleco Telestar brand is the last one that I will be discussing from the first gen of consoles. The name encapsulated a variety of home consoles that were released and marketed by Coleco from 1976 to 1978. The first release being a Pong clone, because that was the only way people got started back in the day. This was followed up by Telestar Classic, which was just a cosmetic redesign of the one released earlier in the year. And now a warning from here on out, pretty much every one of these consoles' names is preluded by Coleco Telestar, so I'm just gonna list the actual names of the consoles and leave out the Coleco's Telestar part. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. In 1977, Coleco released the Deluxe with French and English text to market to Canadians. The Ranger, the Alpha, the Colormatic, the Regent, the Galaxy, Gemini, Arcade, and the coolest of them all, Telestar Combat. With the exception of Combat, all the games were pretty much just Pong variations, with Combat featuring variations of key games as Tank, and Arcade featuring Tennis, Road Racing, and Quick Draw. The three models released in '78 were the Markstron and the Colortron, which again just included variations of Pong because no one could really be more creative than that at that point. Notable platforms of the second generation include the Fairchild Channel F, the Atari 2600, Intellivision, Odyssey 2, and ColecoVision. These consoles rose alongside arcade popularity during the first golden age of games, which I discussed last week. In November of 1976, Fairchild Semiconductor released the Fairchild Channel F, which was the first CPU-based console. This introduced the age of cartridge-based game code storage, and the console also featured a pause button, so players were now able to actually go pee and take breaks. The cartridges themselves could hold up to 4 games per cartridge, and the console came with 2 pre-installed games, hockey and tennis. In 1977, Atari released the Atari 2600, which was originally called the Video Computer System, and this was their first CPU-based console. Atari released 9 games for the holiday season of '77, and since they held exclusive rights to most of the popular arcade games of the day, they were actually able to just transfer over those games onto their machines without having competition for them. These game advantages, alongside their superior pricing, actually meant that Atari sold more units than Intellivision and was able to continue to hold the dominating lead over the game market despite having inferior graphics to the Intellivision. An important thing to know about the second generation of consoles was that pretty much all the CPUs were 8-bit, although they would not be referred as the 8-bit generation the way the third generation would be. In 1982, Atari released the Atari 5200 in an attempt to compete with the Intellivision. While it was superior to the Atari 2600, a lot of the poor sales and lack of new games meant that this console would only be supported for about 2 years before it was completely discontinued, while the Atari 2600 would continue to live on. The Bally Astrocade was released in 1977 and was, for some reason, only available through a mail order. On top of this, there were lots of delays in production, meaning that none of the units would actually ship until 1978, and because of the mail ordering, it sold mostly just at computer stores and didn't really have any retail exposure the same way that Atari did. In 1978, Magnavox released its sequel to the Odyssey, titled the Odyssey 2, in United States and Canada. The main feature of this system was the speech synthesis unit that was able to give speech capabilities to the games as well as create music and sound effects. The Odyssey 2 was also known for its fusion of board and video games, so some of the games that were shipped with the Odyssey 2 or you could purchase for the Odyssey 2 actually came with game boards and pieces that the players could use to play the game in conjunction with the video version of the game that would play on the console. And the Odyssey 2 would be discontinued in 1984. Now, the big console we've been mentioning has been the Intellivision, which was introduced by Mattel in 1980. This Intellivision console actually contained a 16-bit processor, which was long before the 16-bit era that would come later in the 4th generation. Intellivision was also the first console with a thumbpad directional controller and tile-based playfields with vertical and horizontal scrolling. It also offered downloadable content through the Play Cable service, which was an online service that was introduced in the 80s that allowed local cable television system operators to send games for the Intellivision over cable wires alongside the normal TV signals. Essentially, the way that worked would be like a retro PlayStation network. People would subscribe to use a device called the Play Cable adapter and be able to download games to play on their Intellivision. This allowed the Intellivision to be the first console that had a service that allowed users to download games to play. And despite the fact it wasn't widely adopted, it still makes its mark on history as the first time we were able to download content for our consoles. The Intellivision's ad campaigns also used side-by-side game comparisons to show the improved graphics and sound compared to those on the Atari 2600. The console itself wasn't discontinued until 1990. The ColecoVision was introduced by Coleco in in 1982, and it was much more powerful than their previous consoles. It actually provided an experience that was closer to arcades than what the 2600 was able to replicate. The ColecoVision also launched with Zaxxon, which is personally one of my favorite early arcade games, and actually saw a lot of support from other developers such as Activision and even Atari. Something kind of funny is Atari actually ends up suing ColecoVision later for creating an expansion module that allowed the console to play the Atari 2600 games, and Atari didn't like that, so they sued them. And the console was ultimately discontinued in 1985 due to the video game crash that happens in 1983. The Vectrex was released in 1982 and actually featured vector graphics and its own self-contained display. And even though it was able to deliver higher quality versions of arcade games, it ended up being a commercial failure and was on the market for less than 2 years. Moving on into the famously dubbed 8-bit generation, the third generation of home consoles featured some of the great competitors to Atari, such as the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System. The first console that was created by Sega was called the SG-1000. However, it kind of was a commercial flop and doesn't have too much cultural significance to the generation itself, aside from the fact that the hardware was more advanced than those that we saw in the second generation. Not to mention, they somehow managed to launch the same day Nintendo launched the Famicom, so they kind of messed up there in Japan, which as a result affected its American release as well. The SG-1000 only ever released in Japan and Australia, and the fact that it released on the same day as the Famicom in Japan probably had something to do with its impact on sales in not only Japan itself, but Australia as well. Famicom released in 1983 in Japan and in 1985 in North America as the NES. The NES is a 8-bit cartridge-based console that was developed and marketed by Nintendo and became the most popular console of the generation, selling over 60 million units. And it became the most popular console of the generation. It was the first home system to feature a controller with a directional pad, and later that directional pad became the industry standard. The NES also had this really cute little accessory called Rob, who was robotic operating buddy, and it had a really short lifespan, but he was really cute, and I can't not talk about him when I mentioned the NES. Rob only had 2 games that he would actually play with the player on the NES, and in fact, I feel like most people just know him as that character in Smash that everyone plays. The Sega Mark III would release in 1985 and was actually the third iteration of the SG-1000. The name was later changed to Master System for release outside of Japan in areas such as the US, and it was actually designed to be much more powerful than the NES, but it didn't match the success just simply due to the already existing popularity of the Nintendo Entertainment System. This generation really did see the decline of Atari, as the Atari 7800 was released in 1986, and while being the successor to the Atari 5200, it didn't sell as well as the Master System or the NES would, and this really showed that Atari was no longer on top of the console video game market. However, the Atari 7800 was the first console to ever have backwards compatibility without having to install any additional hardware to the console itself. All the consoles mentioned aside from the SG-1000 had actually integrated over to cartridge game storage, with the NES actually being able to use a 3-inch floppy disk with the Famicom disk system. However, this apparently was only a Japan thing. The SG-1000 could use cassettes and data cards as well, but they required additional attachments. Sorry for the abrupt end to this video. If you keep up with my community posts at all, you know that originally this video was going to be about 50 minutes long, and when I recorded it last week, I had tried to also make a second video and tried to kind of revamp the style of my videos, because I feel like as I've done YouTube, I've fallen more and more into like myself and who I am as a brand and how I create things. But I have this tendency to overwork myself. I'm a bit of a workaholic, and I've always known this about myself, but what happens is anytime I try to take too big of a step too quickly, it does lead to a burnout. And unfortunately, that's what happened with this video, as well as the video that I released last week, because a couple weeks ago was when I recorded this video, as well as the other video, and basically all I'm trying to say is this is part 1. Parts 2 and 3 are going to be released over the next couple weeks while I kind of learn a little bit more about myself and my self-employment and try to create a schedule for myself that isn't not only sustainable but creates better content for you. And I know this seems silly to make a big deal to explain at the end of a video when I don't have a crazy amount of subscribers and I don't even have a crazy amount of views, but I still want to maintain a professional standpoint because I really do treat this like my job even if I'm not currently making any money from it. And yeah, I just want to say thanks for watching my videos. As always, it's been nice talking to you. I'm Purple Sark and I'm logging off. Bye.